It appears that Lorna and I had met previously, but in 2003, when I'd come back from my first tour of duty in Papua New Guinea, I met Lorna again, and she asked me how I was going at settling back into Brisbane. And I said I found it a bit difficult, and she said, we must have dinner one night and we'll chat about how you felt it, because when I came back from overseas I felt the same way, having been over a few years overseas. So we did that, and it went from there. We were together here in Brisbane for a while, and then we went to Papua New Guinea in 2006. I was working at the time on an AusAid project with the law and justice sector. So that included police, corrections, the Ombudsman's office, the public prosecutor, the public solicitor, every of the magistrates, the judges. So I was working on family and sexual violence most of the time, trying to make sure that they understood the implications of it and applied the law and dealt with it as best they could. Family and sexual violence. Actually, the cough started when we were in Papua New Guinea. She'd had cerebral malaria. She didn't like using sprays to keep the mosquitoes away from her. And when she got over the malaria side of it, she ended up with this little cough. It wasn't a phlegmy cough, it was just a cough that was persistent. We then had to go back to Papua New Guinea for another 2 weeks, and then my contract had finished. When we came back down to Brisbane at the end of my term of my contract, what occurred was the cough kept going, and she was getting a bit tired. She was going through a whole range of symptoms, and so she went to her doctor, who thought it was the onset of adult asthma. And unfortunately, I wrote a note to him and I said, here are Lorna's symptoms. In other words, please do something more than give her puffers for asthma. And when he got that note, he took her straight in to have a breath test, and he went and rang up and arranged for a CT scan the next day. And when that result came in, it was shown that she had various things on her lungs, and she had some other issues that he wasn't sure about, so he arranged for further tests. Unfortunately, when we got there, they did a bronchoscopy. They found she did have lung cancer, and then they gave her a PET scan, and they found it in her spine, in her pelvis, in her sternum, and numerous other places. She was stage 4 at that stage, and we were initially given 12 to 18 months for her to live. Everything we were told would be for palliative care. She lived for nearly 3 years. Well, nearly 3 years from that diagnosis through till when she passed away in April 2011. I was born in Cairns, and I was the youngest of 4 children. Mum and Dad were married just when the war started in 1939. I was very fortunate to have a wonderful family. My mum and dad were supportive of me, as were my 3 siblings, a brother and 2 sisters. So I went to school in Cairns, both primary and secondary, and I left school in after I finished grade 10. I went to work initially in Cairns, and then at 15 years of age I applied for and got a job in the state public service here in Brisbane. Mum and Dad were wonderful parents. Dad always used to say what you mean and mean what you say, and Mum was pretty well on the same track. They were both volunteers, in terms of Dad with the sailing on a Sunday afternoon, and Mum with the Cairns Juvenile Choir, with the Cairns Juvenile of Stedford, and later on with the Garden Club. So we had good role models in their formal volunteering sense, plus also there were always little things you were sent to do for neighbours and other people around the area in Glen. So I had a good, supportive family relationship. They were always the type of parents who used to say, we want our kids to have a better chance than we did. Dad was a member of the Waterside Workers Federation, actually, and he was at one stage an officer in the union up in Cairns. But when I was young, I used to go to the meetings with him, and I learned a lot about meeting procedures from watching those meetings. However, it was interesting at school. We went to the Catholic schools, myself till I was in grade 5, but the rest of the kids till they finished their schooling. And the nuns a couple of times had a go at the sister next up from me about her father being a wharfie. And he felt that his involvement in the union wasn't going to do his kids any good at school, so he pulled out from the executive positions but retained his membership with the union. So I learned a lot about social justice there, because they weren't the same sort of unionists who would then chip in dollars to keep the striking workers who they benefited from their efforts. They wouldn't chip in to pay them any wages while they were out on strike. They were difficult times because the men had to pay fees so that when they were on strike for weeks and weeks at a time, there was some income coming in. Mum kept a vegetable garden, and we had fruit trees like Five Corners, now called star fruit, and mandarins and oranges, and then she grew all the vegetables. So we were lucky that we had Mum's skills as a gardener there to supplement income when Dad was on strike for weeks on end. My schooling was interesting. I left the Catholic school at grade 5, at the end of second term of grade 5, and went to Cairns Central, and then I went to Cairns State High School. I did a commercial course at school, and Mum and Dad always had the view that we were to go on to grade 12, senior as it was in those days. However, while the other 3 did do that, I decided no one was going to go without for me. So I said I was leaving school in grade 10. And it's an interesting thing that I left school in grade 10. I hadn't even read a book because I was too sports mad. Now I've written one. So it's a very interesting road on my path to education. This is the book that I wrote. It was part of my master's thesis. I did a Master of Administration at Griffith University, and my thesis was on the Whitrod era and reform in policing. The Whitrod era in Queensland Police was from the early 70s, and he left in 1976, and he'd fallen out, I'd say is the best way to put it, with the Queensland government under the premiership of Joe Bjelke-Petersen at the time. And then in the Fitzgerald inquiry later on, he was more or less proven to be right in what he was trying to achieve. I knew from when I was young that I was a lesbian, but after I left home when I was 15 and came to Brisbane to work in the public sector, I didn't do much about my sexuality at that stage. I certainly wasn't like the rest of the girls where I was working in terms of going out and having boyfriends and carrying on. I then went back to Cairns a year later, and I was working in the SGIO in Cairns, and the manager put me as a clerk to do work, which in those days women couldn't be clerks. And the woman who was my secretary was actually a lesbian. She was in her late 50s, and just the way she was so open about her sexuality, at one level it was terrific, but at another level, watching the reaction and the responses of people to her, it was very sad. And I think I took the line that methinks she does protest too much. And so at that stage I didn't do anything about my sexuality. When I came to Brisbane then, a year and a half later, I met up with some lesbians and I knew I was home. I didn't get to talk to Mum and Dad for a few years, although my then girlfriend, my first living girlfriend, and I went home and had a holiday at Mum and Dad's, and they were accepting of both us and the other couple that we'd taken with us. We drove up to Cairns and it was a great holiday. So over the years they realised, and Mum, for someone who was born in 1913, she was great, because when my two sisters were married and people would say, "And Jill, when are you getting married?" and Mum would jump in pretty quick and say, "Jill always says she doesn't want to be married, so that's good. We'd prefer that than to her to be in an unhappy marriage." She was very supportive right from day one. At one particular time, my girlfriend and I were in bed at home, and Mum and Dad were down from Cairns staying at my place. And the next morning, Mum came in to the bedroom and said, "Now, Jill, you still have a cup of tea first off in the mornings?" I said, "Yes, thanks, Mum, white and 2 sugars it was then." And she said to my partner, "And what would you like to drink, dear?" And dear said, "I'll have tea as well, thanks, Marge." And when Mum went out to make tea to bring it into us, my partner just said to me, "Could you imagine my mother doing that?" I said, "No, I couldn't actually, but Mum's doing it, and that's nice, isn't it?" She said, "God, I've never seen anything like it." So things like that, I think, showed that Mum was very accepting. When I did come out as a lesbian in the late 60s, early 70s, one of the places where we used to congregate was at the Camp Club in George Street, Brisbane. And the police would pull up over in Tank Street that comes to a T-junction with George Street, and they'd come over and raid the club. At that time, some of us had stepped through the windows and out onto the awnings. Some of the guys would put on aprons to make like they were staff helping there. It was a bring your own alcohol sort of thing, and you could get a toasted sandwich there, so as well as the dancing. It was a very interesting time, and I guess I got to see a whole different side of what it meant to be part of the lesbian community, for that to go on. In those early days, of course, I was still a public servant, and it was in 1973 that I started to do senior by night school, and at the same time I applied to join the police. And you could say, well, after seeing that negative side of policing and harassment, why would you have done that? And it was because I didn't want to be sitting in an office for the rest of my life doing nothing, so the aim was to either do senior and do teaching, or to join the police where I wouldn't be just sitting in an office. So I made up my mind to do it. I studied hard, worked hard, and I decided that there were certain things that I wouldn't put up with when I was in policing. And I think I tried to stay true to my word throughout my whole career. When I joined the police, in those days, in 1973, when I was sworn in, we first were sent to Brisbane Mobile Patrols. After that, we got sent out after 3 or 4 months there. We got sent on to other stations and other areas of the police. I applied for a transfer anywhere other than Brisbane. So I got sent up to Caloundra. And I was the first policewoman to go to Caloundra, so it was very interesting that when I got there, the sergeant first class in charge of the station said, "You will have to go up to Nambour, where the district officer is, Jill. He likes to speak to new police when they arrive." And I said, "Or everyone?" And they're mainly the police women, because there were only about 3 or 4 of us up there at the time. 3 before me, or 2 before me. So when I got up there, and he was a lovely man, that district officer, the inspector, and he started talking to me about what it was like to be a police officer in a smaller community, and how I would have to be very careful about how I behaved, because people could extend on from what they saw you doing, and then if you got with the wrong types, there could be repercussions when you were trying to do your job. It was nothing to do with my sexuality, but men didn't get the same talk as we did in regard to their behaviour. There was no assumption about my sexuality in any manner, shape or form. It was just with regard to, I think he was referring to getting with bad types of men, and having affairs and maybe getting pregnant and all those kinds of things, more so. I think he was as much embarrassed about it as I was in some ways, although he did get a cup of tea and we sat and we had a good chat, generally, after that little chat he gave me. After Caloundra, I actually applied to go to the CIB in Brisbane. The reason being, we'd had the Beerburra Mail hold up when I was at Caloundra, and there was a squad of detectives up there working, and they encouraged me to think about a career in the CIB because I'd assisted them in a number of ways while that investigation was going on. So I applied for and was appointed as a plainclothes constable to the Brisbane CIB in 1975. It was interesting that was the first time, 1975, when I was still up at Caloundra before I'd gone to Brisbane, but a detective who had worked up there with me rang me to go down to his house and see him. He was advising me that a policewoman in the CIB in Brisbane was telling the bosses that I was a lesbian. And I said, well, what should I do about it? And he said, do nothing, but don't forget, I've told you who it is, I've told you what's happened, just keep it at the back of your mind. He said, I just said she's a good worker and didn't see anything like that in the time I was up there, so everything went okay. So I was in plainclothes there from 75, and then in 76 I applied to go to Townsville, CIB, to get my detective appointment. When I arrived in Townsville, after a couple of days, when the guys in the CIB got to know me, they told me how they'd drawn straws to see who was going to work with me, because I was the first female detective to get posted outside of the southeast corner. Hilary Huey had been down at Beenleigh, and there were about 3 or 4 in the CIB at headquarters. So I was the first one to go outside of the southeast corner. After being in Townsville, I applied for and got a transfer back to Brisbane. It was with the break and enter squad at one stage there where I said, this is nuts. I'd done a lot of work on a break and enter offence and then followed the trail and got about 6 offences. Went down to see fingerprints and they lifted prints off some of the jobs and they could tell me who the offender was. I was able to find out his former partner's details. I went and saw her. She gave me his address in Adelaide. So I went back to the head office of CIB and I put in a report to say I've got a warrant for the extradition of, let's say, Joe Blow, and I'm applying to go on the extradition. I was never ever told by any of the bosses, no, you're not going because you're female, but one of my colleagues who took a phone call from detectives in Adelaide told me when I walked back into the office one day that it's obvious, Jill, you're not going to Adelaide. They're sending one of the boys, mates of the bosses. So with that I went down to the recruitment office where the Inspector for Personnel was stationed, and I said, sir, I'd like to see you about a transfer to uniform. And he said, what do you want to do that for? I said, because I'm not going to put up with sexism in this job. And he said, what if I get you a transfer? What will happen then if you get sick of it and you wish you were back in the branch? I said, that won't happen. Anyway, he was true to his word and I was true to my word. I went out to Inala. Inala Police Station's a housing commission area in the western suburbs of Brisbane. And it was while I was stationed there, I was living with a partner who was also in the police. We both had breakfast one morning. She went off to her job and all was well with the world. I went off to my job. I had to go into the coroner's court on North Quay. Anyway, I was sitting there waiting to give evidence and I saw my partner walk in and she was looking quite stunned and a bit like she was in shell shock. And I went out to her and I said, "Are you okay?" She said, "Come over here." And she told me that she'd been called into CIB headquarters and asked about her sexuality and asked if she was in a relationship with me and did a family know, etc, etc. And I said, "Oh, well, that's okay." They said, "You've got to go down to the court. We know Jill's at the coroner's court. And when she's finished giving evidence, you bring her up here and then we'll interview her." So that was the start of what was the lesbian witch hunt in the Queensland Police Force as it was then in December of 1977. I went up with her and she sat in on my interview. As we walked into the Selby house to the CIB headquarters, I went into another office, the licensing branch. I used the phone to make 2 calls to lesbians I knew, warning them about what was on and suggesting they not come in without a lawyer if they were called in. I then went upstairs with my partner and there was an inspector taking notes and a superintendent doing the interview. And he asked if I was in a relationship with my partner. I said, "Yes, I am." And I started to ask about what was going on and why was it of any interest and didn't get very many successful answers. And I said, "Well, it's got nothing to do with my work, obviously, because I consider I'm more capable and competent than most of my heterosexual workmates." And with that, the inspector doing the writing said, "How do you spell heterosexual?" The superintendent asking the questions, he went outside. I think he went out to laugh. Anyway, we finished that interview. We were never asked to read over the record of interview they took. We were never given at that time a copy of the records of interview that were taken from a partner or myself. During all of this, not long after, a couple of days after the interviews regarding the lesbian relationship that my partner and I were in, we were over at my sister's and her husband's and we told them about what was going on. And it was my brother-in-law who actually said, "Well, that's just silly. If they transfer you," and they said one to Cairns and one to Coolangatta, "if the relationships don't work out with that tyranny of distance, you'll get another partner. It could be another policewoman. So then, let's say it doesn't work out, you then find another partner in the police. So then they've got 4 instead of the 2. And when they find out about those and they do their silly old investigations and one gets sent to Toowoomba and one gets sent to Longreach and one gets sent to Rockhampton, one gets sent somewhere else, it's just mushrooming a situation, because if those relationships don't survive the tyranny of distance, you're still not going to change your sexuality. Then you both end up from 2, now we're up to 8 if you..." And it went on, and by this stage we were just rolling around the floor laughing. It was a bit sad, but that's when I decided I'd go and see the Deputy Commissioner and point out the error of their ways in terms of the process they were using. I went in to see the Deputy Commissioner and I told him, I said, "Sir, my brother-in-law says all you're doing is mushrooming a situation, because it's a sexuality that's not going to change just because you transfer us. If the relationships don't work, we'll find another lesbian partner. If they're in the police, then you could end up with 4 instead of 2. And then if you find out about those new relationships, then you send them on their merry way. The same thing will happen again. and again, and you end up with more lesbians than you can deal with. And he's gone white by this stage and said, Jill, we never thought of that. So, as a consequence of the lesbian witch hunt, my partner was transferred to Longreach and I was transferred to Mount Isa. And unfortunately, they didn't realise I'd had advice to go and get the skin specialist certificate. So when I went in to see them the next time, I said, here's a medical certificate from a dermatologist saying I shouldn't be transferred to Mount Isa because of my very fair skin. Anyway, the next thing I heard was I got a call to go in and see the Assistant Commissioner for Personnel, and he said to me, Jill, I've got some good news and bad news, come and sit down. I sat down and he said, the good news is you're not going to Mount Isa. And I said, oh yeah, what's the bad news? He said, you're going to Toowoomba. So in effect, I still was moved out of my house. And the sad thing from where I sit is that my partner ended up resigning, and they just lost a very good police officer. I didn't resign. In fact, the whole thing really emboldened me because I just did what my folk had always said, say what you mean and mean what you say. So I did speak out more. So as a consequence of that experience, I went to talk with a colleague of mine who was also a sergeant, and I told her, come on, get your hat, we're going for a walk. And I told her what had gone on. And when I finished telling her, she said, I think we should go and see the boss, because her boss was then the Assistant Commissioner of Personnel, and he was a lovely man. He listened while I told my story, and he said, as of tomorrow, you're starting in my area. You'll be doing special projects for me. I want you to do some stuff on victims of crime and workplace health and safety. And that new program you brought back from Victoria, you can work on that as well, which was protected behaviours. So I did. And in the personnel branch one day, I decided I'd look for my file. And I looked in my file and there was a note saying that I was to be transferred away from Brisbane and not to be allowed to interact with the community during my working time. And two of the other people were also noted on that file, so no doubt copies were on their files too. When you think about it, the lesbian witch hunt was in 77, and at the time I was looking at these files, it was 87, so that was a decade later. So it takes a long time to get the whole strings to the bow, if you will. And in fact, the next time the lesbian investigation, the lesbian witch hunt, entered my life was in 1993, when the CJC was doing an investigation into another policewoman, and she claimed that it was because of the lesbian witch hunt that she'd been charged criminally, and they called me in to ask me about the witch hunt. At this time I'm a Chief Superintendent of Police, and I went in there and I said, I don't know why you're asking me about it. You've got all the records here that you've had since the Fitzgerald inquiry. Oh, well, we want to ask you some extra questions as well. So that they did. And one of my weaknesses is if I get angry, I get a bit teary. So when that was all over, while they were typing up my statement for this internal investigation they were doing, I went downstairs to have a cigarette just for something different, and a colleague came in and he said to me, Gillo, what's wrong? And I told him what had happened. He said, don't go anywhere. He said, you wait here, I'll go and see if I can get a copy for you. He went up to see Sir Max Bingham, who was the chair of the CJC at the time, and within 10 minutes he was back with a copy of the record. And that's the first time I read it. It wasn't even a true and accurate copy of what had gone on that day. at CIB headquarters. I had a few firsts in my career. I was the first female detective to go outside the southeast corner. I was the first policewoman to go over work on Palm Island when I was in Townsville CI branch. I certainly went to the budget branch. I was the first female, well, the first police officer really, to go to Adelaide for 6 months to the National Police Research Unit, do the National Police Research Unit's course down there for police researchers. I was up at Sergeant First Class very early, if one policewoman had been there before me. And then I was in the first 5 police women made up to Inspector after the Fitzgerald inquiry. I was the first superintendent and I was the first Chief Superintendent. So I had a number of first achievements in my day. When you think about it, I did have a successful career. Despite Joby Peterson's Queensland, I was successful. After the witch hunt, I actually became more emboldened because my parents and what they taught us, say what you mean what you say, because of my innate honesty too. There's nothing that anyone could hold over me. And now that the department knew about my sexuality, which I readily admitted, what else could they do to me? I was out loud and proud, and their problem, not mine. One of the jobs I had during, it would have been about 89, was we brought in the Domestic Violence Family Protection Act in Queensland, and myself and another sergeant worked on the policies, the procedures, working with other areas within the police about how we would go about the implementation of this legislation. I guess one of the important things that had happened a couple of years earlier, before this, we were starting to catch up with the times. The offence of rape in marriage was made, because before that it said a man who had carnal knowledge of a woman without her consent was guilty of rape. But if it was his wife, it couldn't be rape. So with that amendment, we'd already had the change from married women, and then with this coming in to protect them in the domestic violence, not only of sexual assaults, but physical abuse and other forms of abuse, it was a massive change in the state. So it was a big change in the regime for dealing with domestic violence, to such a degree that we were at that stage in 1990, we had the most applications for a protection order for a victim of domestic violence in Australia. And the federal government Office of Women had a conference in Adelaide, and I was asked to go down and present a paper on what we'd done here in Queensland that made it so successful. Prior to my resignation, I'd gone through another one of many anonymous complaints that were investigated. And this was the straw that broke the camel's back in one way, because there were things like wearing my name badge crookedly, walking around in stockinged feet in my office, etc., etc., etc. It was just lunacy. So it was a way that they wanted me out of the job, and at another level I couldn't have been bothered staying there because of the personal stuff going on with my sister and mum and dad having to move and all those things. I've never regretted, not for 1 minute, that I left the police. Yeah, it was an interesting time when Lorna was diagnosed with her cancer. She was the most wonderful partner to have with such a dreadful diagnosis. She's very stoic, and she used to say things like, "Aren't we lucky, love, being back here in Queensland? Imagine if we're in Papua New Guinea and I wanted a cup of tea, someone would have to go and light the fire and boil the billy." And all this sort of thing. She was very, very good. Anyway, she decided she got a bit of the travel bug, and we travelled overseas to Europe and Africa and down to Tasmania and over to New Zealand. She wanted to go, and we went. The last 2 nights of Lorna's life, on the Thursday and the Friday night, the nurses on night duty, I could tell when her pain was getting bigger, because by this stage she's not talking. And I could see the frown coming. I rang the bell, and when the 2 nurses came in, they gave her a shot of morphine as well. And they said, "You know, Jill, if that was my partner, I'd love to hop in and have a cuddle. Come on, we'll tuck you in." I said, "Well, I don't think so, because what if I throw my arm on my leg and I hurt it?" "No, you won't do that, truly." So they tucked me in. First night, the Thursday night, I stayed 5 hours with her. I didn't sleep, but I did stay there, and then I got up and went and had a cigarette. And then the next night I stayed 3 hours with her. They did that the last 2 nights of Lorna's life, and it meant a lot to me.